Earlier today, I spoke to Sir Peter Fahy, who was national lead for the Prevent programme from 2010 to 2015. I started by asking him to explain why Prevent was set up in the first place.
Well, the Prevent programme was really started at the beginning of that sort of emerging threat from Al-Qaeda and from ISIS, which is essentially were about foreign groups radicalising particularly young people in our country, particularly by the internet, and then going on to commit violent acts or try and travel to Syria in particular to fight with ISIS. And that's what Prevent was about. And it is based on the definition of terrorism, which requires an ideological basis to what you're going to do, an ideological motive based on a political or religious philosophy. And that is the challenge, I think, really, that the Prime Minister has identified, that the definition and the reality of terrorism and the terrorist threat, and really the threat from violence, has changed. And the definition and the working methods of Prevent have not kept up with that change.
Yeah, it focuses on terrorism, extremism, those referred to Prevent having ideologies in line with that. Is this the gap then? Rudakubana referred by schools 3 times to Prevent programme. Each time wasn't seen as a risk within the framework of Prevent as it stands now. Is that what you're saying? Is that why it wasn't taken further?
Yes, because the Prevent assessment looks at, is there an ideological basis to what this person is trying to do? Does it fit the definition in law of terrorism and a terrorist threat? And the fact is, there are far, far more people who are violent, lots of young people that are causing concern, that are referred by schools and other agencies into Prevent, often because there's no other programme out there, and only a small number are then taken up. And so I would hope the inquiry that the Prime Minister has announced will look at that, will stand right back to say the agencies need to work closer together. But I would hope the inquiry will be radical enough to say, in terms of this, we need to stand right back and say, where is the greatest threat coming from? And certainly, while this was an absolutely horrendous attack in Southport, for instance, we know that far more children are killed in family circumstances by people known to them. Far more women, for instance, are killed and murdered than are ever killed. People are killed in a terrorist attack. So, it is about the way that threat has changed. And again, as the Prime Minister identified, often the ideological basis is totally unclear. And in this case, this individual seems to have looked at people like Adolf Hitler on the right wing, has looked at Al-Qaeda manuals, or is just pure, extremely violent tendencies. And that's the challenge that the police and other agencies looking at this have to use, particularly when they're having to apply it to the traditional definition of terrorism.
It's easy now, isn't it, to look at all the information that's out there. Now it's in one place and summarised. I mean, the referrals happened first when he was 13 in 2019 and twice more in 2021. After expressing interest in school shootings, the London Bridge attack, the IRA, MI5 in the Middle East, he also had contact with police, the Home Secretary saying today it's on record that, he was caught carrying a knife 10 times. He had contact with the courts, the justice system and mental health services in the years before he carried out the Southport attack. People tonight will be listening and watching these details emerge and think, how did he slip through the net? Why wasn't there any kind of organisation or authority that was willing to take a look at this and go, this young man could be a severe threat to the public?
Well, the reality is, number one, there are lots of particularly young people and young men who have similar characteristics that are there in the system. And therefore, most of the agencies are sort of overwhelmed with the number of young people that are being referred to them. Particularly if you look at carrying a knife. We know, sadly, that huge numbers of young people are going around carrying knives. So I'm sure the inquiry will look at, were there other programmes, what else were these agencies doing if Prevent did not fit this particular, the criteria of this individual. But the fact is, even if somebody is identified as having very violent tendencies, the police can't go out and arrest somebody for having violent tendencies. They have to start an investigation, and ultimately they would have to put a huge amount of resources to try and find out what this guy's doing. They just can't go out and arrest somebody. just on the say-so of those concerned. So there needs to be a reality about what the police are actually capable of doing, and a real understanding about, as I say, the number of young people, in particular young men, who are showing these sorts of characteristics. One politician has highlighted the fact he was excluded from school. We know, sadly, a huge proportion of people who are in prison have a history of being excluded from school. It is one of the strongest indicators that somebody's going to go on and have a criminal career. Now, that's not to say that more could not have been done, but the fact is that a lot of these programs, particularly dealing with young people who are being affected by things on the internet and all sorts of other strange ideas in their heads, those programs need to be much better funded. And really, we need to move from investigating things after they've happened into much broader prevention programs to try and identify why are particularly so many young men showing these violent tendencies, and particularly, as we know as well, particularly these violent tendencies towards women.
Prevent, is it fit for purpose at the moment? Does that need to change and modernise and be updated as soon as possible?
Well, as I say, I've been part of an independent national inquiry that's been looking at terrorism legislation and Prevent. And really, from all the evidence we've heard, it is saying, absolutely, we need to do this in a very different way. We need to have a much clearer join up with all the other agencies. And indeed, the Home Office recently did fund a pilot in areas like Greater Manchester and a number of areas where this was done very differently. You join up all the agencies in one place, you share all that information, and through that you identify who are the most problematic people, and then you apply all the different powers and intelligence and different things from all those agencies to do that. So that's really, what I think needs to come out of this. We need to step back and say, who are the people, who pose the greatest threat, risk and harm, and then make sure all the agencies, including local communities, schools, voluntary groups, parents, are focused on those people, and that we don't really have a Prevent program working to a definition which is now really out of kilter with the reality of not just modern terrorism, but the modern threat of violent crime.
A public inquiry has been called for by the government. What would you like to see come out of that will really make a difference?
Well, I think there'll be a frustration, number one. There have been a lot of different reviews, particularly of the Prevent programme. The last government did one called a Shawcross review. A lot of that has not been implemented, but unfortunately ended up in a sort of culture wars between should they be looking at right-wing or Islamist threat, which wasn't really the main issue. So I hope this inquiry, will not get into a lot of that, but actually stand back, look at the evidence of where is the threat, try and inform the public through its work to have a more considered debate about these things and a greater understanding of the nature of modern violent crime and where that threat is coming from, and then advocate a very different way of how agencies work together to actually challenge that.